Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an Adult Services Specialist with the library. Thank you for joining our program, Uncovering Your Family History. Today's presenter, Elizabeth Keating, is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, where she's taught for over 25 years. She's been a Fulbright Scholar in Ireland, a visiting fellow in the School of Language and Literature at the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies in Germany, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands. She's the author of several books and many articles about language and culture. Today, she will speak about her most recent book, The Essential Questions: Interview Your Family to Uncover Stories and Bridge Generations. Please welcome Dr. Keating.
I'm really glad to meet everybody and very glad to be here today and talk about my book, which was published last fall and has received a great reception from people who are very, very excited to have a way that they can work towards understanding their family history better. So let me tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. What happened to me was my mother died. Many of us feel loss in our lives. It's always a very difficult event and experience. And it wasn't until my mother died that I realized that there was so much that I didn't know about her. And I've talked to quite a few people since that time who have had the same experience. The ironic thing was that I had interviewed my mother a couple of years before she died, but I hadn't asked her the right questions. I'd asked her about the family tree to fill in some of the people that I didn't know. But after she died, I just wanted to know more about her. What was it like when she grew up, and what things troubled her? What were her teenage years like, and what was her childhood like? What was it even like to grow up in that world? So I thought, well, I'm an anthropologist. Why don't I take an anthropological approach to finding out about people's past lives, the experiences they've had? Anthropologists go out to different places of the world and learn about people who are very different from themselves. And in fact, my mother was certainly very different from myself and had grown up in a completely different culture. It might not seem like a whole different culture, but so many things have changed, as everyone knows, in the last 50, 60, 70 years, that it could almost be a different culture. So I decided to start interviewing people and to work with some questions and see what kinds of questions would elicit the information that I now wish I had about my mother. So I started out with an anthropological approach. What is it that anthropologists want to know when they go somewhere else? They want to know about everyday life. They want to know about the houses people live in, the kinds of clothes that they wear, what their dating practices are, what their beliefs are, and many things like that. So I devised a set of questions and I interviewed people in many different parts of the world who were elderly. And I had such a wonderful time learning about what it was like when they grew up. I was having such a good time interviewing people that I didn't want my students to miss out on interviewing their parents and grandparents. And so I started to give my students at the University of Texas for about 5 years the assignment, one of their assignments during the semester, to interview one of their grandparents. And they absolutely loved the project. I gave them the anthropologically focused questions, and they went out and interviewed their grandparent. It was something that they didn't even know they wanted to do until they started to do it. And they said things to me like they never had any idea about the experiences that their grandparent had had. until they sat down and talked with them about it. So I decided for sure to write the book then, because my students had such a marvelous time and they built bridges between themselves and their grandparents as well. So they would say in class that now they could have lots of different conversations with their grandparent that they wouldn't have known how to start or how to have these conversations before. So I worked some more on interviewing people, and then I wrote the book based on the anthropological approach. So what do I mean by an anthropological approach? Well, what an anthropologist does when they go to the field, when I went to do my first field work, for example, on a small island in the Pacific north of New Guinea and east of the Philippines, we have to take with ourselves not only our own lack of knowledge, but also the idea that we want to have an open mind about what we encounter, that we want to be sure that we give people the benefit of the doubt and try to understand them on their own terms. It's really easy if you go to visit a small island in the Pacific to judge everything within your own terms. There's so many practices that were different on that island. But I tried to become a person from their own point of view. So I tried to understand how their ideas fit together and listen to them tell me about the different ways, things that they had experienced and the everyday practices that are important to them. So anthropologists are really interested in the ordinary and the everyday. And I know that probably doesn't sound as exciting and dramatic as some of the big events that we're used to seeing on a cultural scale. But you know, ordinary life is what you really miss when it's gone. And it's the stuff that makes our sense of who we are. And so the questions in the book are designed to find out about ordinary life and to also to find out from the point of view of someone that you may not have ever imagined that that might have been their point of view at a particular time. In the book, there's also quite a bit, there's a whole chapter on interviewing. What's the best way to conduct a successful interview? Anthropologists do interview, but they also do a lot of what we call participant observation. So we hang around with the islanders or whoever, and we live with them. We eat their food. We dress the way they do, and we take part in everything that they do every day. Well, that's not possible, of course, to go back into the past and to do that. So in this case, we rely quite a lot on the interview, but the interview is a lot of fun. And some of the keys to interviewing are things like, be sure to let them do all the talking. So you want to make sure that somebody is able to tell the story in their own way from their own point of view. So you have to give them space for that and help people to tell their story their way by creating an environment in which they feel very comfortable. And one of the big things with interviewing I mentioned in the book is you have to be able to be silent. So in American culture, we are not used to having very big gaps between when one person finishes talking and the next person starts. In fact, we can sometimes think there's something wrong or it's a little bit awkward. But in this interview situation, you have to remember that people are trying to think and recall things, and so they need some silence. So I tell people to try to be able to hold a 7-second silence. And when I was first doing research, that was really hard for me to learn, and I learned it the hard way by listening to my audio tape afterwards and seeing how many times I had cut the person off and redirected their talk, unfortunately, because I then was very curious what they were going to say. I've heard many, many wonderful stories, as you can imagine, about times in the past. And I don't want to talk too much without giving people a chance to ask a question if they have a question at this point. Um, and I'm happy to take questions as we move along to talk about the different aspects of the book. So, any questions out there?
So yes, there are quite a few questions coming in. So one of the first ones is, I have lost my parents, grandparents, grandaunts, and uncles. Have I lost my opportunities to get this information, and what might be my options?
That's an excellent question. One of the things you can do is to look for peers of your relatives. These would be people who might have shared some of their uh, upbringing with them or known them as friends when they were young. That can be very, very rich in terms of learning something about your relatives. Of course, it's very, very sad that you can't hear it from them personally, but there likely are people that you can find who would know them quite well, especially at particular times in their life. You might not find someone who shared their whole experience, but different people who shared experiences with them, say in school or in some kind of a club or something like that.
Good. So I think this is probably a common question you might get asked. How do you deal with persons that don't want to be interviewed or recorded?
Yes, people who are reluctant to be interviewed sometimes are worried that they are not going to give you what you want or help you in the way that you want. I've had people tell me that they thought their life was just too ordinary to be of any interest to anyone. And once I persuaded them that I was interested in their particular life, I was astonished at the amazing things that they had accomplished against huge odds. So people are often not able to see what's ordinary about their own life. If they don't want to be interviewed at all, uh, I would at least make a try to persuade them that you're really, really interested their uh, in their part of creating the family for what it is. And maybe they can begin by talking about other members of the family first, and then they become a bit more comfortable about themselves. Often people are just unsure about the whole formal interview part. And sometimes people are reluctant to be recorded as well, but you really want to record them because at least audio record them, which is what most people do, because it's just too difficult to capture those magic words and those individual and unique ways that people have of expressing themselves. But I would give it a try. Sometimes people are just unsure of what the whole experience will be like.
Okay. So we have another question kind of along that lines. What is the best method to record the conversations? Would you recommend notes, recorder, or video?
I would definitely recommend the recorder for most people. I think most people would be a bit too self-conscious with a video camera. However, if you can persuade people, I mean, some people are just very much in the public uh, space in terms of liking to perform or liking to be on camera. So that would be wonderful to capture more of them for not just yourself, but for your own, for the rest of your family coming along. So definitely recording. If you try to take notes, it's just very, very difficult because people talk too fast and you can't get the complete note down. And very often you're you're not able to be a good interviewer because you're having to do two jobs at once, write things down accurately, and then figure out what to ask next. So it's much better to record. Most people can just use their phone to record. It's very easy. I always use two recorders just because it takes so much to get the event set up and to get someone to agree. And you don't want to waste their time, and you want it to be as productive as possible. So I usually have two recorders going, my phone and one other recorder. And then afterwards, in terms of transcribing it is really fun because you get to hear it all again. And some of the nuances you might not have gathered the first time, and you can pick them up the second time. So that's a very enjoyable process.
Okay, thank you. We got lots of questions today, Dr. Keating.
That's great.
Everyone's very, very interested in knowing more about their family history for sure. So one of the next question is, how do you use old photos in your interview process?
That is a nice idea. I haven't actually used old photos. They're not part of the book. The book is mainly about recalling, just trying to describe a time and a place from memory. And what I'm trying to get at there is for people to give us a clue of what was really powerful to them. And so a photograph is going to be somewhat um, um, neutral. In other words, maybe someone we don't really even know sometimes who took the photograph and what their perspective is. So I haven't used photographs in the book. At the same time, I think they're a wonderful idea. I think to use photographs is an excellent way to ask questions that you need to know the answer to. So after my mother died, of course, there were pictures that who had characters in them that I didn't know, and I wish I had asked. So it's an excellent idea. It's a good adjunct.
Okay, so there was another question about photographs, although you don't use them in your book, but perhaps your background might assist in this question. Do you have any suggestions for identifying photos of ancestors that no one recognizes?
Yes, I don't. I think that's a tough one. I suppose you could check with friends that might go beyond the circle that you've already checked, because I don't know of any, let's say, any way that you could use material that's already in existence to match photos. Someone else might have that expertise, but I don't really have that expertise. I think that's one of the tough things. It's even really hard to recognize some people in photographs because they change physically so dramatically.
Okay. So the next question, what are your approaches with sensitive revelations, such as rape, incest, adoption, murder, etc.? Or is it best just to let sleeping dogs lie?
Important question, certainly. The way that the essential questions in the book are organized is to be very, very broad questions. So there are 13 questions. One of them is very introductory to get people warmed up, just a little bit of biographical detail. The rest of them are pretty substantive questions, like what was the house you grew up in like? And so the questions themselves can, they can be engaged in many different ways. So there's a lot of ways to talk about what the home was like by talking about the number of bedrooms or the number, or whether it was in the fields or in the town. And so there are many, many topics that someone could talk about without having to disclose uncomfortable memories. It would be perfectly up to them if they decided for that to be one of the things that they did talk about. So there's a question about their belief system. And by beliefs, I am trying to get at not religious beliefs necessarily, although, of course, those are part of any belief system, but people's beliefs about things like women or marriage or jobs that have naturally changed over their lifespan. And it's interesting to understand some of those earlier beliefs, to understand better the person and the time. So even with the question about beliefs, I think it would be up to that person what they wanted to talk about. And I think that, of course, one of the things that people often raise is the question about wartime. Sometimes people don't want to talk about wartime. My father didn't want to talk about World War II. And so I never really pressed him on it. I think that's the sensitive thing to do. There's so much else to talk about in a person's life for sure, but it's best to use your own judgment there about what the person is going to be comfortable with. Of course, we want them to be very comfortable. And what you'll find is as people start talking, they just can talk for hours usually, and have and remember things that they thought they'd forgotten.
Right. And I know as I read through your book, I really liked how the questions just was introductory, just kind of thinking, just conversation. And then you, of course, dug deeper and deeper as that comfort zone, that comfort level, whoever you might have been speaking with was ready for. So there's definitely a very practical way to look at the questions, but also I know you did it on purpose to build up that sense of comfort and ease as they're talking about maybe difficult situations or other parts of their life.
Yes, I wanted each person to be in control of the narrative. So that's why the questions are designed so broadly. They can actually, and sometimes people would be in the middle of answering a question and they would say, oh, I'm way off track. And I would say, no, that's perfectly fine. Just go where your memories take you. And then later on, if I was on a question that I thought they might have already covered, then I might ask it a little bit differently or something. But yeah, people do start to do exactly what you want them to do, is to recreate a world for you.
Good, thank you. So a few more questions. So this one says, my father was adopted and I was able to find a half brother and sisters on his mother's side through 23andMe, the website 23andMe. He's also connected with a cousin on his father's side. However, he's stuck. Can the right questions really unlock more information for him?
Yes, I can just tell you about a person who was a podcast host who interviewed me, a couple. They, the wife told me before we started the interview, or maybe during the interview, I can't remember, but she said that her husband, sitting there in front of us, never said he didn't remember a thing about his childhood, or hardly anything. And then she started asking him the first question in the book about, what was your childhood home like? And suddenly he described a picture of his boyhood bedroom, the books in it, the telescope that he used to use from his window, and what it was that made it, drew his interest in the telescope, and so many other things. So I think if you do have the right questions, and if they're descriptive enough to begin with, I think that we're all pretty good at description, and it's the description that brings these worlds to life for us.
Thank you. So another question is, I'm the oldest generation in the family now. What can I do to preserve what I know with the generations coming behind me?
Oh, it's so great that you're going to do that for them. They have no idea how much they're going to appreciate that. I would try to interview as many people as you can so you can get their words on tape or on film so that you can have a record that way, because the the sound of someone's own voice, everyone's voice is so unique and particular, and each person has their own way of talking, that that's as much a part of what you want to save as anything else. Language changes over time, the way people speak changes, and also their uh, their ways of describing the past are so interesting.
Okay. So in your opinion, what is the best way to curate any photos or documents that you might have from the person that you're interviewing?
Well, you would want to get as much information as you possibly can about the photograph. So some things might seem self-explanatory when you look at a photograph. And of course, they do right after the picture's taken, especially if you were there. But if you weren't there, there's going to be a lot of questions about what things are, not just the time and the place, but the background and what the occasion was, and why were those people standing next to each other, and what was their relationship to each other. Funny incident of that in field work, when I was on the small Pacific island, I did a lot of videotaping. Back then, my dissertation advisor was very keen on videotaping. I was studying linguistic anthropology, language and culture, and he thought that language was not language without understanding the role of the body in these symbolic systems. And so I was carrying my video camera, a very big camera back in those days, around with me, and it was fabulous. The islanders loved it because to them, whenever I asked them how to do something, they would say, just watch. So to them, it made perfect sense that I would be video recording things. But I got back to the US and I realized that I didn't know the clan relationships of some of the people in a particular video that I had made. And I needed to know their clan relationships because there were certain topics that they could talk about with each other if they were members of certain clans. So I took a frame grab and sent it to the island to one of the priests and asked him if he would identify it for me and send it back. And he was kind enough to do that. But at that time, I hadn't realized that was the clan identification that I would need. So I would say in the case of your pictures, just try to get as much information as you possibly can think of. You know, whose car is it in the background, or what street it is, and things like that.
So maybe kind of a similar question and similar to what some of the others have, but it says, because I have missed the opportunity to meet many of my immediate ancestors, parents, grandparents, and such, what do you recommend that I leave for my children or grandchildren now?
A lot of people have asked me if it's worth asking themselves some of the questions in the book. And I think that is a good idea in terms of getting a structure for how to describe ordinary life and some of the important, say, coming of age and socialization experiences, and the way that even that everyday interactions were. Because this is the sort of thing that you don't think of writing down because it just seems so ordinary and known at the time. But ordinary interaction is very, very interesting. And what is possible to say to people and who is allowed to talk to whom and so forth can change over time. So the key is really to get a good description of what an anthropologist would want to know. If an anthropologist was visiting you and living with you for a year, what would they observe? What would they want to know? And those would be the sort of things that you would want to record for your family, because all of those things are going to change. I've talked to people who rode horses to school and people who uh, cooked on a wood stove and knew that the oven was right for biscuits when they just stuck their nose down there and it felt hot enough. And all of those ways of doing things, you won't know about them unless someone tells you. You might hear that kids rode horses to school, but you don't hear that the three of them had to ride on the back of one horse. And the the sister was the one that got stuck on the back. And one day she complained to the mother that she always had to ride on the back. So her mother told the boys to let her sit on the front. And they did that till they got out of sight of the house. And then they said, okay, back in the back with you. So what does riding the horse to school mean? It intersects with all these other kinds of sibling rivalries and also the sort of luck of being the third in line.
Yeah, and you make a good point that just our everyday life is important, because during COVID, the pandemic, I was just writing down general things, not the big stuff, but just general things of how quickly our life was changing. We were, of course, all at home together. We were cooking meals differently. And to me, I think in even 5-10 years from now, we're going to look back at just that everyday life of what we did that, right? Because everything has changed just so quickly. We forget about our little things in life that really equals our life.
That's right. And you'll wish you'd written some more of those details down so you could remember them, because they were so unusual.
Right. We have another question. This one is, my grandmother lives overseas, so she can only have discussions over the telephone, which makes recording difficult. Would you recommend setting a time and day to have these discussions, or just allow the conversation to flow during our regular chats?
Yes, that's an interesting question. You can actually do both. I don't know how often you talk with her. I think initially it would be good to do it in a more formal way. So set something up so that you can ask the questions. And then if it's likely you might not get finished in one opportunity, so you could try other opportunities or always add to it. In terms of recording, if you put her on speakerphone, you would be able to record. That would be one way to do it. They do have devices for recording from phones, but those were the old landline phones. They probably have something like that for mobile phones. I'm not really sure, but I've recorded people by just putting them on speakerphone, and it's usually a fairly good quality, especially if you put so you'd have to have a different phone, of course. You couldn't use the same phone to record, but that would be one way to do it. And I used to talk to my mother a lot on the phone by speakerphone anyway, and it worked really well for us.
Okay. How would you incorporate maybe letters that were exchanged through your grandparents or your mother? How would you incorporate that into the interview or in ways of documenting the story?
Nice idea. Yes. Letters are so different from speech. The way people organize their thoughts in a letter and the way they express themselves in a letter, they're very, very different genres. especially if people were formal letter writers, they really were works of art. So but they can have a lot of good information in them that you could certainly ask more about, or you could ask questions about the letters themselves in order to understand them better. I think there are some just fantastic letter writers, and wish more of them were published. But it's a lot harder to write it all out. If you were to ask your grandparent to write the answer to all these questions, they might not actually get through the project because it's tough, to put your words in a coherent way that's entertaining for someone to read is a much bigger effort than it is to understand and respond to their expressions of interest as you're in a conversation.
Yes. Good. We don't have any questions right now, but we have a few more minutes if anyone wants to add to ask Dr. Keating anything. I think she's enjoyed all the questions. I think they're very common problems and questions that people have probably as they're thinking about doing this. So what would be your best advice to someone who is just now kind of pondering the idea of doing this? What would be your advice to them?
I would, certainly buy the book or borrow the book from the library to get a sense of what you can ask. I think a lot of people think they can only ask about weddings or marriages or those sorts of happenings in a family, and they forget about the everyday life. And so I would have people think about what it, how would they create a scene, and how would they invite someone to create a scene that was from their childhood, something that happened to them, or even just the way it looked in their house, and who's how did people eat together? Did they eat every evening together? Did they have different bedrooms for boys and girls? And all of these kinds of ways of organizing the household are very interesting.
Okay, thank you. We do have one more question here. Is there a privacy issue with attaching an interview on ancestry.com or perhaps another site that deals with genealogy?
I would certainly want to have the person's permission whose interview it is. Do they give their permission to have it distributed in a different format, other than outside the family? I think everyone should have the right to agree to that. And then beyond that, because you're talking about an actual identity too, a lot of what we do in research, for example, in the book, all of the people that I interviewed, I had to give pseudonyms to because that's required by the human subjects protocol at the university. I did name my students. A lot of my students were generous and let me use bits of their findings, of their interviews. And then I listed them by first name in the back as we agreed. But I think because it's an ancestry issue where people want to know who the person is exactly, then you definitely would want to have that person's permission. And it's very easy. You just need a simple signature form. In other words, I give permission for this interview of mine dated this date to be published on ancestry.com or however you want to word that, but it just can be a simple sentence like that, and then they sign their name.
And this one is not a direct question that a guest had, but if your mother or grandmother or somebody, whoever you're interviewing, has dementia or other health conditions and maybe can't answer all the questions, or only has a limited memory, maybe from their early childhood or something that might trigger that memory, what would you do in that situation?
I think it depends on the person. I know that when people have dementia, they do have good days and bad days. And they also often, as you say, remember the early days very well. One of my students said that one of his grandparents was starting to experience dementia, but he said he still remembered his childhood and teenage years very well. And then this student sent me an email a couple of years later and said that his grandfather had passed away, and he was so glad that he had the interview because his grandfather used to live down the street from him, and he misses him. So I think it depends on the case and the day and so forth. I think it's worth a try, certainly, to see if there's anything that people can remember.
We had one more question. I have an audio recording of my mother who had essential tremors, making her voice difficult to understand. Are there any services to help with something like this?
That's a good question. I would be surprised if there wasn't something like that. Um, so you would, so perhaps something that could adjust the tape speed or something like that to make it more understandable. I think there are programs that you can download for your computer that can adjust the tape speed. So you could possibly do it yourself, but I'm not sure. I don't have any expertise on that, but I would be surprised if there isn't such a service worth. In the United States, there are so many specialists on so many different topics.
And then this was a follow-up question from the previous one about asking permission. So the person that was interviewed is now deceased. Should they ask permission from their children?
About publishing the interview, I would think, I'm not sure about the legality of that. In other words, I don't know whether it's required or not, but I certainly think it would be the best thing to do, because people do feel protective of their family and information about their families. So I think that it would be that would be prudent, definitely, to do, and keep tensions in the family from rising or from getting into any issues about people having disagreements with each other. But I also think it's possible to take a lot out. If something is objectionable, you can take certain items out. Often it's just a name or perhaps an incident that might be sensitive, whereas the rest of it would be perfectly fine to share.
Okay. Well, Dr. Keating, I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much for speaking and sharing your knowledge with us. And I do highly recommend either checking out the book, The Essential Questions by Dr. Elizabeth Keating, or it does make a really nice gift or to purchase because of the questions and the note taking and the information that's in there. It's almost like a journal. So it might be something that you would want to purchase to have as your own copy. But we want to thank you again for joining us and answering our many, many questions today. And we hope we can see you again next time.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a huge pleasure. And thank you for all your wonderful questions and best wishes with your finding out about your family history.